All right, so I'm showing officially 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time here in Elmsford, New York, which is about a half an hour north of New York City. And we're here to talk about editing landscape photography in Adobe Photoshop. I'm going to be using Photoshop CS5 today. If there's anything I do that is peculiar to CS5, meaning it doesn't exist in previous versions, I will let you know. I'm also going to show you some really cool stuff using a couple of other programs that work with Photoshop from both Topaz and Nik. So hopefully that'll be good. So today's sponsor is x-rite, and x-rite has got some of my favorite tools, including the Passport and the Color Checker, Color Checker Passport and the Color Monkey. I'll mention them briefly because I use them all the time in my landscape photography. And if you go on x-ritephoto.com, there's a lot of cool educational stuff there, a lot of videos, a lot of PDFs, including some that I've done for them. I'm really a firm believer in their stuff. And it's me. While I'm very often the presenter in our webinars here, today's session kind of puts me in the guest speaker category. I'm going to share with you today tips and techniques I've accumulated having used and taught Adobe Photoshop for going on almost 20 years. It's hard to imagine. For those of you that haven't spent time with me online in the past, my name is Joe Brady, and I'm the Webinar Marketing Manager at the Mac Group in Elmsford, New York. What I do here is I create and present educational programs for photographers. One of my specialties is color workflow, and what that means is I get to make sure that the prints I get back, whether it be from my lab, off my desktop printer, or in a book, match the images I saw on the screen. Now, as a guest presenter, we always ask our guest presenters what kind of stuff do they use. I use lots of different equipment, yeah, including a guitar, not for photography. As far as cameras, my two main cameras are a Canon 5D and a 7D. For some landscape work, I use a medium format digital back, which is a complete another world. And I also use what happens to be available. I'm actually going to show you a couple of images that are remarkably good that I shot with my $149 Canon PowerShot. So it's not always the camera that is going to determine how good your image is. It's really your view and your creativity that you bring to the image. So let's get started on a couple of basics about our shooting part before we actually get into the Photoshop part. Now, I want to talk a little about white balance because it really confuses people. White balance is a real important first step because it's kind of setting the baseline upon which all your colors are going to be built. Even if you're creating a custom camera profile, which I do with the Color Checker Passport and is a subject for another day, having a good white balance is really important. Now, the one question I get asked all the time from landscape shooters is, how do you white balance for sunrise and sunset? And that's a really good question. Me personally, again, the things I'm going to show you today are my personal way of doing things. One of the things about Photoshop and these other programs is there's always 20 ways to do the same thing. I'm going to show you ways that have worked for me. I was an art director for 8 years at an ad agency, and in that kind of environment, you have to work quickly and efficiently. So I've gained a lot of experience in making things fast. I think you're going to be amazed at some of the things you can do very quickly that we're going to see today. So again, white balance, really important. If you're shooting sunrise or sunset, me personally, what I do with white balance is I do my white balance in the middle of the day at that location. I don't want to neutralize out that warm glow of the late afternoon or early morning sun. So I will create my custom camera profile and my white balance sometime generally around noon. Also, many of you have joined me before. Please stay away from auto white balance. I'm going to do some panoramic stitchings. If you were on auto white balance, it can be a disaster because it's going to change the color in every shot. So we want to make sure that you're picking, if you're not on auto white balance, pick a color temperature that makes sense. So for example, if it's sunny out, choose the sunny icon on your camera. If it's cloudy, choose that. If you're shooting inside, shoot tungsten. If you're shooting flash, choose that. I also will frequently take a picture of my Color Checker white card, which you see right here, so that I have a reference and I can fine-tune my white balance after the fact, should I need to. And this is best done with RAW files, but it applies to JPEGs as well. The beauty of the RAW files is I also get to use camera profiles, and you'll see the effect of that shortly. Now, I mentioned the Color Checker Passport. I know many of you have heard me speak about this before. My favorite tool. It goes with me everywhere I shoot, because not only does it give me that neutral reference, but I create a custom profile for my camera at different locations. And what that allows me to do is completely dial in the color perfectly with one click. Now I'll show you that when we're in Adobe Camera Raw. Also, again, especially those that you joined me yesterday or in previous webinars, your monitor is really important. You've got to make sure that your monitor is set. And if you think about it, it might not be obvious, but the monitor is the one piece of equipment that's going to have the single largest effect on how well your prints come out, because that's where you're making your decisions. So you've got to get your monitor calibrated and profiled. You need hardware to do this. Again, I talk about this in detail in other webinars, but if you're not doing this yet, make sure you do it. Oh, and by the way, as a little tease, at the end of the presentation, I've got some special offers from our sponsors, as well as some discount codes for both Nik and Topaz, so stay tuned for that as well. Now, something that happens all the time, and I'm a PPA member, being a wedding portrait photographer, and I run into this all the time. I hear this from all my colleagues. They get prints back, either back from the lab or off their own printers, that are darker. They're darker than they want. Typically, the reason for this is your monitor is simply set too bright. Now, one of the things, unfortunately, that can happen is sometimes you set your monitor up correctly, but if you're working on a laptop and you have something that's got one of the cameras built in, like the MacBook Pro, what ends up happening is there's a control panel option in the Mac system where, and it exists on PCs as well, where the computer will automatically adjust its brightness based on the ambient light. It's actually reading it through the in-computer camera. You got to make sure you disable that, because if you don't, your monitor might all of a sudden turn brighter than you want it to, and if it's too bright, your prints end up coming back darker. If you make sure you calibrate your monitor, then what you see on the screen is what's going to come out. After we do a bunch of edits, maybe the last image, I'll do a quick soft proof to show you where you make sure that happens. Also, another good question, just to clear up the whole white card thing. Does the white card have to be in the same exact image I'm shooting, or does it just need to be in the same time of day and area? Good question, Nick. Just kind of same day and area. If you really want to be accurate about it, though, it's just easier because the file comes along with your shot. Before you take your shot or right after you take your shot, just flip up the card and take a picture that's got something that you can eyedropper off of, because that just makes it easy. Now, if you're using a MacBook, in fact, let's just do that. I got a lot of MacBook users out there. Let's go into the system preferences. I want to show you something, and we'll take a look under displays. And here it is right here. See, it says automatically adjust brightness as ambient light changes. You got to make sure that is clicked off, because you don't want your monitor changing its brightness through the course of the day. So that's where you do that. Okay, so we just saw this. Okay, now I'm not going to actually go through a full monitor calibration today because we got lots of Photoshop stuff to do. And if you go onto x-rite-photo.com, you'll see webinars and videos that go through the calibration process. But I like using the Color Monkey, again, one of my favorite tools, because it allows me to do not only calibrate my monitor, but it allows me to create custom profiles for my printer so that I get prints that exactly match my monitor. It's a beautiful thing. Now, one of the things about calibrating a monitor, another good question just came through. If you've got a monitor that is way too bright, or your settings are off, again, I'm not going to go into detail about that, but here's the settings that you would actually want to set in software, which again, I'm not going to show you. Brightness, no brighter than 120, and the best is about 80. A compromise is in 100, but that's where you want to be, in that 80 to 120 range. Anything brighter than that, you're going to start to get prints that look darker. Gamma or contrast curve should be 2.2 for everybody. It doesn't matter if you're a PC or a Macintosh. 2.2 is the gamma, and the color temperature of your monitor should be D65 or 6500K. Now, if you're just using, if you're sending out to a lab primarily and not doing your own printing, You can use something like the i1 Display 2 from x-rite. Again, go on to x-ritephoto.com and they can tell you all about that. They run around, oh, you have to look online and see. I don't know what they're actually selling for out on the street. Figure the $200 range, plus or minus. The Color Monkey, I believe everybody pretty much offers for $449. Again, but stay tuned. At the end of the webinar, I'll have a discount code for you. Now, soft proofing, I'll show you this briefly when towards the end when we're in Photoshop. Soft proofing is a great tool because what it allows you to do is to adjust your image based on how it's going to print before you actually print it. What you do is you look at the image through the printer's paper profile, and it affects on screen what effect the paper is going to have on the image. And we'll see that briefly when we get into Photoshop. All right, we're going to go into Photoshop. One thing real quick, however, I just want to talk about something about landscape photography in general. Now, landscape photography is one of my real passions. But I would like you to ask yourself, why photograph the landscape? Why do you want to do this? Well, you might just be wanting to capture a memory or record that you were there, or you might be wanting to create a photograph, and that's what I'm after today. A great landscape photograph is kind of like a fine portrait. What you want to do is communicate what your feelings were about the space to your audience. You want to give a feeling of place. If it's appropriate, you want to tell a story, and you want to invite the viewer into your images so that they kind of want to immerse themselves into the scene. They want to explore around. And if you manage to pull that off, if the viewer is drawn into the scene and wants to stay a while to explore, then you've really succeeded. If the viewer can imagine being in your place when you took the photograph and feels what you felt and understands why you made that particular image, then you've really hit a home run. So let's go into Photoshop and make that happen. And let me hide the other stuff. Actually, I'm going to open up Bridge too because I'm going to bring up some images here. And we're going to start kind of more on basic, and then we're going to work into some real heavy-duty editing. And again, keep your questions coming. Love to see that. And again, just to go, some of you are asking some more monitor questions. Brightness range is handled through the calibration software that comes with the device. There's nothing you're going to do on your monitor. That said, when you do a brightness adjustment on your monitor through the software, you might notice that, well, from brightness all the way up, you have to click, say, 4 or 5 down to get to the correct brightness based on your calibration. So if you remember that, it's a good way you can, without recalibrating, you can kind of get kind of in the same ballpark. All right, so I'm going to start with a very basic image, and this is a JPEG file. This was just shot with my little point-and-shoot camera that only shoots JPEGs. It's an inexpensive one I just carry around for snapshots. However, one of the real powers of Photoshop is the ability to take your JPEGs, even though they are JPEGs, and that is open them up in Adobe Camera Raw. Because Adobe Camera Raw has a lot of powerful tools in it that will make your edits a lot easier. But most people think you can only open up RAW files in it. Well, not true actually. If I click on this image, and on a Mac it's Command R, on a PC it's Control R, if I just hit Command R, it takes that JPEG and it opens it up in Adobe Camera Raw. Here we are. Even though it's a JPEG, I'm now open in Adobe Camera Raw. Now this is a excuse me, this is a sunrise in St. Augustine, Florida, and I was just out shooting one day with my son. And the image recorded kind of dull on my point and shoot, and I really wanted to put a lot more oomph into it than we see here. So let's make some adjustments. Now exposure-wise, it's pretty good. If I look at the histogram up here, I've got data from all the way black to all the way light. Color temperature is fine, but it's missing a lot of saturation. So let's take care of that first. I'm going to add a bunch of saturation to this because this was a very intense sunrise. Actually, it needs a lot. This camera, I guess, apparently is missing some. We'll add a little more in Photoshop. Let's just kind of get it straight. I'm going to add a little more contrast too, to add a little more oomph to the image. And I don't have any highlight blowouts. If I turn up, I have a little bit. This is the highlight warning, by the way, in Adobe Camera Raw. And what I can do is drag the recovery slider over and make that red disappear. Now I don't have any blowouts. By the way, if you drag your recovery slider all the way to the right and you still have stuff blown out, that means it's gone. It means there's no data there, so there's nothing you can do to recover it. So just go ahead and do that. Now, if you always want to open your JPEGs in Adobe Camera Raw, you can set that in your preferences in Bridge. I don't like to do it for every image, but I do like to do it for some. All right, so I lost a little bit of brightness by doing that. So let me just increase the fill light. Exposure's good. Blacks might be a little too dense. I also have a black warning here, which I can turn on right at this little blue button. And you can see I've got some little bit of blue on the edge of these piers, but that's actually okay. Let's put it fit back into view. Now, a couple of the other cool things that I would do here is this button right here is called Detail. It's also for sharpening. And when I'm doing this, I like to go to about 200% to see what the effect is. So I'll bring the hand over. I just want to see if I've got too much noise. Let's increase the sharpening a little bit. I'm going to add about 60 points to it. And I like to keep the radius below 1 pixel because that keeps any halos from happening. And when you do that kind of sharpening, you have a tendency to introduce a little bit of noise into solid areas. So I'm going to turn on the noise reduction a smidge and the contrast and color noise. And that cleaned it up. And again, we're looking at it at 200%. Okay, so that's about as far as I'm going to go here. Again, since this is a JPEG, I don't have the ability to change the camera profile because that's built into a JPEG file. But I did get to take advantage of these exposure and detail corrections that are really great for even using in your RAW images, or in your JPEGs rather. Now down on the bottom, I had already resized this as a smaller file, but down in this little thing that looks like a link are the workflow options for Adobe Camera Raw. And if you click on size, you'll see the options. I could actually ask Adobe Camera Raw to up-res this image, but you'll have a whole series, and we'll see this again when I bring up some of the bigger images. Adobe RGB, great if I'm going out to my own printer. If I'm going to send this out to a lab, I might want to open it up in sRGB, because that's what the labs generally require. We'll just leave it here for now. So I hit OK, and then I click on Open the Image. So we'll let that open, and I'll hit F to give myself a full screen. And I'll just use the hand tool to move this over. Okay, so we're starting to get there, but it still needs a little bit more. So here's one of the things that I find myself doing to practically every landscape image I have. And that is I'll duplicate the background layer. And you can do that either by dragging to the little folded page, or hit Command or Control J and duplicate the layer. Then I will change what's called the blending mode. The blending modes are all up here. And if you click on them and just stop and take a look, the blending modes are all grouped with these little lines as to kind of what effect they're going to have on the image. This first group here, all of these blending modes will darken the image. All of these will lighten. All of these will increase contrast. Now these are kind of an odd grouping. I don't know how to do it other than they go together because they don't relate to each other in any other way. The only one of these I ever use is difference, and I'll show you that in a demo in a little bit. And then lastly, this last group affects color. We want to add some more contrast to this. So I'm going to choose Overlay. And wow, just doing that, what an extreme result. Typically 100% usually doesn't work. Strangely enough, on this image it actually looks pretty cool. Let me turn it down a little bit anyway. And that's looking pretty good, maybe a little less. Actually, what I like is I like the 100% on the sky, but I don't like it on the middle of the image. It made the middle of the image a little too dark. So I'm going to leave it that way. And I'm going to mask out the effect partly of the overlay by clicking on the layer and clicking down here and adding a layer mask. So now you see I have a mask alongside the image. And I'm getting myself a brush. Well, that's way too big a brush. By the way, one of the absolute fastest techniques that will save you so much editing time is knowing how to resize your brush. In the past, I always used to use the left and right bracket tools, which would make the brush bigger and smaller. You also can adjust them up here where you have the size and hardness adjustment. But stop using all that. Watch this. If you hold down Control Option, or I guess it's Control or Control Alt on a PC, hold them both down. As you drag left and right, that changes the size of the brush. As you drag up and down, it changes the hardness of the edge. And I thank my friend Eddie Tapp for showing me this one, because this has saved me so much time. Also, I'm going to be changing the opacity a lot. And to change the opacity, again, you can come up to the slider. It's a lot easier to just type in a number. So if I type in number 1, oops, I've got to be off of that, sorry. I can type in 10%. If I decide I want 30%, while I'm in the image, I can just hit the 3 key. And that makes it 30, 7 is 70%, 0 is 100%. So typically when I'm doing this, what I'm doing is masking out a little bit. For something like this, I'm going to start about 30% and see how that does. So I'm painting with black. My mask here is set for white. Anywhere I paint with black will start to change how much of that effect is coming through. So as I drag through the middle here, I get to lighten up the areas that I want lighter, while leaving that sky the nice deep color that it is. And that's actually looking pretty good. Just lighten here a little more. In fact, if I hold down Alt or Option and click on the mask, you get to see what it was I just did. So again, just that little bit of masking and that overlay layer changed our image from that to that. Amazing difference very quickly. Also, sometimes I like to darken the sky a little bit up on the top. So we're going to create a new layer by clicking right here. And we're going to change this layer to overlay as well. Now, if you paint on a blank overlay layer, anywhere you paint with black is going to darken. Anywhere you paint with white is going to lighten. And it's a very subtle kind of color, so you want to make it a little softer. So I'm going to start with a 10%. And also, you'll find yourself switching back and forth between black and white all the time when you're doing this burning and dodging stuff. So understand that if you don't know these keyboard shortcuts, they will save you a lot of time. If your colors, say you had some strange colors rather than black and white in your color choices here, if you just hit the D key, the letter D, that puts your default colors back in, which is black and white. And to switch back and forth to black and white, yes, you can go over here and click on this switch foreground and background colors. The easiest way to do it is just hit the X key, and that will, as you switch the X, that will go back and forth. Now, somebody asked a good question, why not use the burn and dodge tool? Yeah, you can do that, but then you're going to be doing it to the image. By you do it here, you're doing it on a layer, and you have the ultimate in control. By the way, a couple of you have mentioned that the video stalled. You're not seeing my screen updates. Let me just double check that. Okay, so here, let's paint with black. Watch what happens. I'm at 10%, and as I paint with black up along the top of the image, it starts to get a little darker. Let me do the same on the bottom just so you can see. And if I switch to white and paint with white, then it lightens the image. Now that was a real subtle little bit of painting we did right there, but watch what happens as I turn it on and off. We just went from that to that, and it's changed the focus of the image. The focal point now, since you've got that light area surrounding the pier, you're more focused in by doing that. All right, so I'm going to leave this image right here because we have a lot more to cover. But that was just a quick, simple demonstration of a couple of steps that you can do. If you try that duplicate layer overlay command and then bring the saturation down in your images, you're going to be amazed what it's going to do. All right, so let's close that one and move on to another one. Actually, I'm going to open both of these because one I already have set up more. Okay, one is a JPEG, and then one is a file that's already got a demonstration layers in it. And again, for those of you that have joined us late, the webinar is being recorded. So if you joined us late, you won't miss anything. And if anybody has to leave early, we will have the webinar available for you that you can watch at your leisure. All right, so again, F to go to full screen. And here we have an image of Zion. Yes, it's fine, but it's lacking drama. It's lacking some impact. So let's go through that same process. Again, I'm going to duplicate the layer. And, oops, I duplicated the wrong layer. Hold on a second. Sorry about that. Click my background, Command J to duplicate the layer. I'll change it to overlay. Now 100% for this image is going to be way too strong. You can see it's adding a lot of impact, but a little too much. So I'm going to bring the opacity down. Typically for most images, I find an opacity as a starting point is about 30%. Actually, this one needs a little more. We'll make this about 40%. Okay, that's a good starting point. So I've got my image starting to look a little better. Now let's go ahead and add one of those burning dodging layers. So I'll create a new layer. And again, with white I can lighten, with black I can darken. So where do I want the viewer to focus in on this image? I have this bright sky in foreground, but I'm really interested in these peaks that are going on over here. So I'm going to bring up my brush, again Command or Control Alt, drag right and left to make the brush bigger. I'm going to go fairly big brush, and I'm going to go about 20% and see what that, oh, too much. Why? Because I forgot to change it to overlay. Remember, change your blank layer to overlay. Oh, one other thing that you can do that might make it easier to find out what's going on is when you create this blank layer is to fill it with 50% gray, which is right here. So if I fill this with 50% gray, as an overlay layer, notice nothing has happened. If I change it to normal, you'll see I just get a solid page of 50% gray. What overlay does is anything lighter than 50% gray will lighten the image, anything darker will darken the image. So again, I hit D to put my white and black as my default colors, X to switch them. So now as I paint with white, that's working a lot better. Let's move this over. Make my brush a little smaller, add a little more. I'm going to add some more brightness on this piece of sun popping through the clouds. And on the other hand, I want to darken up some of the shadows. So X to switch to black, and I'll darken some of the shadow areas. And again, I'm just doing this fairly roughly. It's amazing how simple this is. I'm going to zoom out a bit and give myself a real big brush so that I can work in the foreground. I'm going to go down to 10% and drag under the foreground, and I'm going to darken the very top of the sky as well. Alright, so now we're looking a little better, and I'm going to put myself a big light swath across the middle. The last thing I'm going to do is give myself a really tiny brush, and I'm actually going to lighten up this tree. Now one of the easiest ways to do this, rather than try to drag, someone asked if I use a Wacom tablet. Yes, I do. Actually, but today I'm actually using, believe it or not, I'm using my Trackpad on my MacBook Pro. So you don't always have to have the best tools with you. You can work wherever. However, one real handy trick, this is kind of a straight thing, and trying to drag along this might make for kind of rough edges. Simplest way to paint is to click your starting point. I'm going to make it 20%. Click a starting point, go to where you want it to end. In this case, before the tree makes a turn, hold down the Shift key and click. And what that does is it drags the brush right through. I can do the same thing here. Make the brush a little smaller. Let me zoom in here so you can see a little better what's going on. Get my brush, click, go to the end, hold down the Shift key, click again, and I get a straight line. Command 0 to fill the screen. And just so you can see what's been going on, let's make this overlay layer normal. So that's what we just did, just that little bit of adjustments, light and dark. But let's take a look to see that, again, very simple edit. Look at what effect it has on the image as I turn this on and off. We've completely changed kind of the focus of the image. Now, because we have these light areas a little more saturated, it makes it where your eye wants to go. So let me move this down here. Now I also want to adjust the saturation. So let's do a saturation adjustment layer. And again, all my adjustments are going to be done on the layer. And by the way, I filled that with 50% gray. You do not have to do that. You can just leave it blank. The nice thing about it is you get to see how sharp your edges are, and sometimes you might want to soften that. So here's what we did, and one of the nice things about having this is I can then blur. I can go to a Gaussian blur, and I can drag the slider if I want to make sure that my blending is softly done. So I can make that kind of adjustment. That's the nice thing about having the gray. If you forget to do it, not a big deal. It just makes it easier to see what you're doing. Alright, so let's do a Use Saturation adjustment layer. So I click on Use Saturation, and I'm going to add a bunch of saturation and just watch what it does to the image. So let's see. Okay, I'm focused on what my subject matter is, where I want the viewer to look, and that's these peaks in the back. The background might be getting a little too saturated in the sky. I'm not worried about that yet. Let's bring the saturation up so these peaks look good, and that looks good right there. Yes, it made the sky way too saturated. So I want to mask out the sky. Couple of ways I can do this. You could try to select it. I could try to take a brush and paint it out. But let's talk a little bit about selections, because learning how to do selections will save you a lot of time when you're trying to do these kind of edits. So here's how I like to select skies. So make sure you select a background piece of the image. Go to Channels. Now, the magic wand probably wouldn't work great by itself. Let's go ahead and try it. We can bring up the magic wand, and I'll turn off contiguous because I want it to pick up the areas in between the tree. And I can click on that, and it's going to take a while. Although in this case, it actually might work okay. Let's take a look. Yep, strangely enough, in this case, the magic wand actually is working pretty well. Although we did pick up a little bit of the mountain back here and a little bit of the trees. Now this is easily deselected. Pick up, in this case, the Lasso tool. And the Lasso tool, when you're outside of the selection, turns into the Lasso tool as you see the icon. If I hold down Alt or Option, notice it gets a minus next to it. If I hold down Shift, it gets a plus next to it. And by having that minus, that means anything I drag around while that Alt or Option is held in gets deselected from the image. So I can just come in and deselect that area, and then I picked up just a couple of pixels here. Alright, so now that I've got my sky selected and the marching ants are also wrapping around the tree branches, I want to save this selection because I might want it later. So I go to Select, Save Selection. I'll call it something clever like sky. Hit OK. Now I have that selection saved. Now if I go to the Use Saturation mask, what I want to do is mask out that area. So if I hit Option Delete, that will fill anything I have selected with black. So I hit Option Delete, and I will hide my marching ants. So now what has happened is only the foreground is having the Use Saturation applied to it. Now somebody also asked, what's the difference between opacity and fill? Opacity, it will affect the entire layer. As I turn the opacity up and down, it decides what effect this layer is going to have on things below it. Fill, in this case, is going to have the same effect. Fill really comes into when you're dealing with effects. If I were to do layer effects like a drop shadow or something, if I turn off the opacity, the drop shadow could still be there. Not something you're typically going to do in landscape photography, more something that you would do for design work. So it's not something we're really going to talk about today. So here we have our lovely mask. So here's what we ended up with. There's the mask we saved. And we can also go in and clean this up. The beauty of a mask is we can treat it just like any other part of the image. I can go in and paint out these little areas, little extra areas that got selected. Oop, I just messed up there. You can zoom in. And anything you can do to any other part of an image, you can do to a mask as well. You can adjust the levels of it. You might think, why would I want to adjust the levels of a mask? Well, watch. Right now, this mask is 100% black. So none of that saturation is getting applied to the sky, and it's all getting applied to the foreground. Well, maybe I would like to have a little bit of saturation applied to the sky as well, just not as much. So I can actually click on the mask, hit Command or Control L, which brings up the levels while I'm on this layer, and I can actually adjust the density of the mask. So watch what happens. Actually, let me bring up just the mask and hit Command L. And watch what happens as I bring the output level slider up. My black is now not so black. In fact, it's got a value of 61. Here, 128 is 50%. So if I want the mask to apply only 50%, that's where I could do that. And let's do it about here. Hit OK, and then apply it. So now what's happened is I turn this layer on and off. The sky has gotten a little bit of saturation, and the foreground got it all since we had that mask. Now remember, we saved this mask also as a selection. It's actually in our channels now. If you see here, here's the sky. And this is going to be real handy because we're going to want to use this again. So let's go ahead and do one last piece that I like to do. There's a lot more to do. We're just going to show you on some more images to keep things interesting. This is a very handy utility in Photoshop called stacking. And what it allows you to do is to flatten your visible layers without losing them. It's kind of like flattening the image, but getting to keep all your layers. So here's all the layers I want shown. And what I do is hold down the Alt or Option key and then click on the flyout menu, which is right up here. And nothing changes to the menu with Alt or Option down, but I want to choose Merge Visible. Now if I just were to choose Merge Visible, it would flatten all the visible layers into one layer. By holding down Alt or Option, it flattens them into a new layer, but you get to keep all your old layers, and there's a couple of reasons to want to do that. Now I'm going to apply two of my favorite sharpening techniques. First, now I did this on a layer, and I like to sharpen on a separate layer for the same reason I did that mask in Use Saturation. Just watch here. So I'm going to go to Filter, Sharpen, Smart Sharpen. My favorite setting for landscapes is what you see right here. It's 180 at 8/10 or 8/10 of a pixel. And I can make it less, or I can make it more. You can play with it. Depends on the image. And let me come over to a slightly different area here. And try these settings, by the way. You'll be amazed what they do. So I'm going to go ahead and do my 180, 8/10 of a pixel, and apply that sharpening. However, I don't like to sharpen skies. If you sharpen skies, what you do is you introduce grain into the sky. Let's go ahead and look up at the sky here. And you start seeing some grain in the clouds. You can probably see it here. What I want to do is I want to mask out the effect of that sharpening on the sky. So I'm going to create a mask for this. And it's still, oh, I still have a selection. I still have a selection made, so it automatically filled in my mask with my selection. So I'm going to delete that and go to Select, Load Selection. And remember, we saved the sky earlier. And click on OK. So there's my sky selection. Put black in the foreground. Option Delete to fill. Let me make sure I'm on my mask layer. And I once again have my layer loaded. Very cool. So now what's happening is the same thing. This image has been sharpened, but only on the foreground. As you go back up into the sky, there is no sharpening happening on the sky, which is generally something you do not want to do. One last kind of sharpening I like to do is using the high pass filter. And sometimes if an image is a little soft, I might want to do this twice. So let's go ahead and stack one more time. Again, Alt or Option, Merge Visible. So now I've got a stack again. It's got the foreground sharpening. This time I'm going to use the high pass filter. Now I love using this filter on portraits, but in an opposite way. It's under Other. It's part of Photoshop, and it's been in Photoshop for a while. And the default setting, if you've never used it before, is about 10. For landscapes, I typically use somewhere between 3 and 4. So I click on OK, and once again I need to change the blending mode from normal to overlay. And as I turn this on and off, you can see, even on your screen, you can see it very well in this kind of highlight area right here, that it's a different kind of sharpening, and it works really well for landscape images. As I turn that on and off, it adds a lot of crispness to the image. It's a nice effect. Once again, however, I don't want to sharpen the sky. I don't want the clouds to start to get a little crispy and crunchy. So rather than go through that whole selection process again and creating a new mask, watch this. If you hold down Alt or Option on one of your existing masks, I can just drag it to that layer, and it adds that layer mask that we had already used onto that layer. And that's it. Now we just, again, we sharpened the foreground, but didn't touch the background. So that quickly, let's just back up, we went from that to that. Now let's just turn off my menus a little bit so you can see it. A much nicer image. You kind of, again, size matters when you're doing landscape photography, unfortunately, especially large vistas. I have several images in my house, including one that is 90 inches across. So it depends if you're looking for the broad vista or the small detail. Small details work well small. The broad vistas, you're going to have to be at least 20 by 30 to have the impact. But we've got a nice image here from just that, again, short bit of editing. So let's go ahead and close that, and we'll close the original. And let's go inside for a minute. Let's do a kind of an internal landscape here. I'm going to go over this image in more detail, by the way, next week. By the way, there are 2 new webinars next week also. I'm doing one like we're doing today, except it's strictly going to be portrait editing. It's a different kind of set of edits that you need when you're dealing with portraits. And then that's next Tuesday. Next Thursday, I'm doing a webinar on HDR photography. And this is one of the locations I use. But what I'm going to show you here is kind of a manual HDR. Now what I did was I opened up 3 different files. Here's a darker exposure. This is actually to capture the highlights, to keep them from blowing out. Here's a lighter exposure. This was kind of an average for the scene, but we can see that the window is blown out here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to manually do kind of an HDR by just combining these 2 exposures. So here's my second exposure overlaid on top. Now again, if you're not sure how to do this, let me back up one. In fact, let me just take my tabs out again. Let me just split this out. Okay, so if I had 2 images here and I want to put this image on top, I select the Move tool, which is right here, or you can hit the letter V. Hold down the Shift key, because that will make sure everything gets centered, and drag the one image over the other. Now if I go ahead and close this one, and bring up my layers, and get rid of the rest of the stuff, now I can see I've got the image laid exactly over top of itself. And what I can simply do now is start to mask out the highlight areas. Couple ways to do this. So I select the top layer, click on the mask. Now I can take a brush if I wish. Again, Control Alt, and I'll make my brush a little bigger. I'm going to paint a little heavier, and I'm going to mask at about, let's try about 50%. Hit number 5, and just paint over the window. And voila, that quickly I get the exposure from the image underneath. Very cool. Now I can also do the same thing in here. However, that's going to be a little bit difficult to make smooth. So let's back up and find an easier way to do this. I'm going to delete this mask. I'm just going to fill it in with white. And what I'm going to do instead is choose my background image. I'll hide this one. And I'm going to select, under color range, the highlights. Well, here I already have it in the sampled colors, but let's do highlights and see what it gives us. I can also choose to add to this if I do sampled colors. So I can just take my eyedropper and click in the places I want. I can add to it by hitting the plus. And you can see right in here it's adding. I can even add, whoops, too much. I can even add on the actual image. And it's picked up these little fine areas off in the distance as well. Then when I click OK, you can see there's a selection of all the highlights. So now with my lighter foreground chosen, what I can do is I want to mask those areas out of the image. Click on the mask, put black in the foreground, Option Delete, and let me deselect that. And you can see now what we've done is gotten rid of those areas. And I can continue to refine it because it's a little sharp. Again, if I hold down Alt, you can see what it is it's selected. I can then refine it. I'll put my brush in the foreground, and I'm going to further darken some of this foreground imagery from here. All right, that's looking a lot better. Now, this is an interesting scene. This is Eastern State Penitentiary, by the way, in Philadelphia, and yes, I was just visiting. It's kind of Philadelphia's answer to Alcatraz. It's a state park. It's a really cool place for HDR imaging. Now, this was not, yes, I did shoot an HDR shot of this. I have 3 or 4 exposures for this, but I'm showing you a manual way of doing this. My favorite piece of software to use that I use on practically every landscape is called Topaz Adjust. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stack this image. So again, Alt Merge Visible will give me a stack of it. And I'm going to go to Filter, Topaz Labs, Topaz Adjust 4. Now there's a plugin that kind of creates this surreal, crunchy bit. And for those of you that are new to HDR, it means high dynamic range imaging. It's where you combine, typically where you combine multiple exposures to kind of compress a dynamic range of a very contrasty scene. What Topaz Adjust does is it allows you to kind of create a pseudo HDR with one image. And my favorite one for this kind of scene is called Spicify. And you can see, versus just a basic exposure correction versus Spicify, what it does to the image. It does a lot of cool stuff. And there's lots of options here that you can make. I might decide I'm going to add a little more saturation to it as well. Even more than that. And let's see what that looks like. Yeah, that's looking a lot better. And I click OK and let it do its magic. And wow, look at that. Just that quickly, we went from there. I'm letting your screen catch up. We went from there to there. Really cool. Now, some people don't like this effect, and if that's the case, you can tone it down. I use this a lot. Believe it or not, I even use this software in portraits because it brings out details on clothing, and then I'll mask out the places where the skin are. Now, you might like the effect, but think, well, that's a bit much. Well, it's on a layer. So just turn it down a bit, and you can turn it from kind of the surreal to just subtle. But even that subtle bit at 50%, look what it's done to the textures. Look how much it has brought them out. It's amazing. So the last thing I want to do is add a little more mood by, again, doing my favorite burning and dodging effect. And I'll do that by creating a new layer and using that overlay blending mode that we did before. So this Topaz, by the way, it works in, I know it works in CS4. I don't know if it works earlier than that. If you go on to topazlabs.com, you can learn all about it. And again, I'll have a discount coupon for you. You can also download a free trial that's fully functional for a bit. So, okay, I want to just change the focus a little bit. I find this area on the outside is a little too light because I want to kind of direct you down the hallway a little bit. So let me bring up a brush, get a nice big one. And I'm going to paint it about, let's do 30%. So I'm just going to kind of drag around here to darken this, and I'm going to even darken it a little more. I'm going to darken around this window, on the ceiling. I'm kind of trying to direct you down the hall. I just kind of want you to look. Now, if I was really going to work on this image to create a story, what I'd probably do is find kind of a silhouette of a person or something and have them standing down the end of the hallway. So, wow, that's already pretty cool. Look what we just did there. And look at the difference by doing that burning and dodging that way. And again, by having this on a layer, it's infinitely adjustable. Oh, and by the way, someone says, yes, Topaz works great in CS3. So for you CS3 users, you're safe. So again, look what we did. In this, again, this quickly, we went from that to composite to Topaz to burn and dodge. And that's what we get. How cool is that? I just love this stuff. Very cool image. So again, I hope I'm looking at the clock. Holy cow, I'm running low on time, and I didn't get anywhere near close to some of the stuff I want to cover with you. So let's do two more at least. I'm going to open up these two and let them do their thing. Let's see, just a couple questions. Let's see, someone asked where I find Topaz. Actually from a friend, from another photographer friend. And I've seen them at a couple of the trade shows. Just topazlabs.com is the website. Topaz and the Nik software suite are two software sets that I use all the time. The amazing stuff that it will do for your images in a very short period of time will pay for itself very quickly. All right, let me just finish letting this load. Okay, one of them was a raw file. So I've got a shot here. This is North Rim of the Grand Canyon. And I've got my highlight and shadow warnings turned on so I can see where there are issues. And not too much, but let's go ahead and recover the highlights more. And some of them don't really want to recover very well. All right, so we'll deal with them in another way. Oh, there they go. And the blacks, the default setting on black, by the way, is 5. I usually find that a little heavy. I do this in Lightroom 3 as well. I generally work with 2 or 3. All right, so that's looking pretty good as far as exposure goes. And I'm not going to do anything with, I've already got my saturation boosted a bit. I'm not going to do too much with sharpening here. No, I already applied my sharpening. This is my default sharpening, by the way, in Adobe Camera Raw, around 80 with the radius of 0.7 or 0.8 and a little bit of noise reduction. One other cool thing in Adobe Camera Raw, there are lens corrections. This is shot with a Canon 5D Mark II with a 24-70 lens. And notice when I turn on the lens profile, it corrects for any distortion that's built into the wide-angle lens, which is very cool. And lastly, I've got my profile assigned, and I'll go back and show you that in a second. Here's the standard that you get from the Adobe softwares. It's a very kind of basic conversion for your RAWs, but you have a tendency to lose saturation, particularly in the blues. By having a custom profile, which you can see right there, look what happened to the sky. Let me just turn that off. This is what you get with the Adobe standard. By having a custom profile, I get that. It's also, someone asked me a good question, why do I use saturation instead of vibrance? Just so you understand the difference between the two, saturation and vibrance are very similar. Vibrance increases the saturation, but it tries to avoid skin tones. However, in this case, I've got Grand Canyon, which has a lot of tones in it that are very skin tone-like. So if I were to just use the vibration, that's a Freudian slip. If I were to use the vibrance slider alone, it will increase the saturation in other parts of the image, but it's going to leave out these tans and browns because it's kind of viewing them as skin tone. So by using the saturation slider, I can affect the whole image. All right, so let's go ahead and open this. Okay. By the way, there was just a big update both of Adobe Camera Raw and of Lightroom that added a whole bunch of lens profiles and a bunch of cameras. So if you haven't upgraded, make sure you do that because it will add a lot of lenses to that. All right, so real quick, let me go to the one I already have set up as a demo. All right, my other real favorite program is called Viveza, and it's from Nik. So what I do is go to click my background, go to Filter, Nik Software, Viveza. And what Viveza allows you to do is selectively adjust color, contrast, and something called structure, which is like a fine area, kind of close-in contrast adjustment. And it's very simple but very powerful to use. Now I've got these areas here that are a little bit too dark. Even though I want your focus to be in the middle, they're still losing something. And I can do this by adjusting control points. So I click a control point. I can adjust the size of it by dragging here. And again, it's only going to affect colors that are similar, so it's okay if I get some lighter areas. And if I want to increase the brightness a little bit, I just drag the brightness slider up a smidge. Let's do it. Yeah, 18% is good. If I want to increase the contrast, I can do that. Saturation, not a lot going on here. It's kind of a flat part of the image. Its structure is really handy because what structure does is it adjusts fine area contrast. more of a localized thing. Let me do the same thing for over in this area. I'm going to do the same thing, brighten it up a little bit, just so you can see some of the detail in the wall. I'll add a little structure to it as well. And then I can come out into the canyon itself. Now I'll increase saturation locally. So I've chosen the red areas of the rock, and look what it's doing to the image. Very cool. So it's kind of like the burning and dodging I was doing, but it also adds color saturation, contrast, and structure, which is that, again, that fine detail. We've already got a lot of cool stuff that's happened. And I could go further, but I'm running out of time here, so I got to finish up. So let's see what Viveza did for it. I'll let this run. This is a pretty big file. This is a full 21 megapixel file. And I'm actually going to apologize. Boy, I had so much stuff to show you guys. I unfortunately have about 6 hours worth of stuff, so maybe we're going to have to do a part 2. Because I just want to show you how to create a camera profile and what that does. So look what we just did with Viveza. Look what that just did to the image. And Viveza's on niksoftware.com. I'll give you the link again when we're done. One last one I really love to use, and that's in Nik Color Effects, which is one of my other favorites. Color Effects Pro has a landscape filter that is absolutely amazing what it does. And all the color effects filters are grouped by functionality on the left here. I'm going to choose landscape, and what I want is polarization. In essence, what you get to do is practically apply a polarizing filter to your image, and you can see before and after in software if you didn't have a circular polarizer, which really deepens your skies. You can also adjust the rotation, which would change how much polarization is taking place, and the strength of it. So let me just real quick hit OK there and watch what it does. Look at that. It was practically like putting a polarizer on the camera after the fact. Now, it did make, in this case, the sky a little bit dark, but I really like what it did to the canyon here. So I'll just create a mask and a brush, and I'm going to paint it about 60%, and I'm just going to paint over my sky here. It doesn't matter if I go in the tree, because that really wasn't affected by the polarization. So a little more. Let's lighten that up a little more. And again, look at that. We went from there to there. One last filter I'm going to apply. I'm going to do that stack again. Hold down Alt and Merge Visible. And I'm going to go back to my friend, Topaz Adjust. And I'm going to use a different filter, another one of my favorites, called Photopop. And that adds just what it says. It adds a little bit of pop to your images. So let me just check a couple of questions while that's firing it up. Okay. And someone asked, oh, good, someone asked, yes, could I have brushed in the polarizer? Yes. I don't have time to do a full Nik demo here. Oh, that Spicify was left over from last time. We don't want that for that at this image. We want to use Photopop, so let's let that. So I can hold on with the space bar, and I can see the before and after. Works best at 100%, but let's just go ahead and add the Photopop. And so I see it's 2 o'clock. I hope some of you might have to leave. I'm going to ask you guys, you want? Can you hang on for another 5 minutes? Let's see. Can you? Okay. Give me another 5 minutes. I just want to show you something quick about creating a camera profile. Then I will give you the discount codes, and I'll let you know about the future webinars coming up. And obviously, I'm going to have to schedule another session or part 2 of this because there's a lot to do. So here's what our Photopop did. Look what it did to the image as I turn it on and off. It kind of fills in the foreground. It adds that pop to it and creates an incredible image. The last thing I would do, again, would be a sharpening. So I will create a stack again. And yes, somebody asked, oh, don't all these layers make your files big? The answer is, yep. That's okay. I have a lot of RAM and a lot of hard disk space. If you're going to do serious imaging editing on big files, you're going to need to have some storage. So there's my flattened image. I'll go to Sharpen, Smart Sharpen. I'll apply my favorite setting again. And 180 might be a smidge too high, because this is a Canon 5D, which is a very sharp camera to begin with. I'm going to back this off a bit. Let's see what 85% does. Yeah, that's good. So do my 85%. Let the Smart Sharpen filter do its thing. Again, yeah, this is a really big file, so it'll take a minute. I'm actually going to stop it. I have one. I already have one in the oven for you. There we go. I actually had darkened it up, and oh, there was another thing I did to it, but I don't have time for it. So that's how I would do my sharpening. I had also decided to darken up the foreground a little bit as my final image. All right, let's close this and close that. And we'll close this one. All right, let me go back in the bridge for a second. And I just wanted to show you what I do. When I'm on location, I will always shoot the color checker passport. And what this allows me to do is to create a camera profile for the scene. And this is just me. I just hold it out in front of me and take a picture. Doesn't have to fill the screen. This is the only time I have to save an image as a DNG file. So this was in Yellowstone. I'll just give it a name, save it as a DNG file, and then I need to create the profile using the profile creation software, which is a little plugin that comes with the passport. By the way, if you already own a passport, or if you own a mini color checker or a big color checker, you can download this software for free from x-rite-photo.com. So I get the utility software here, and it says go ahead and drag the DNG you just created. Here it is. Click on open, and what it does is it loads the image into the software that I can now, with one click, create a custom camera profile for my camera. Now remember, white balance and profiles are two different things. White balance is setting the overall kind of temperature, kind of baseline. The camera profile will then bring all the colors in line and give you some of those colors that you were losing by using the standard the standard conversion. The standard conversion is safe, but it's very generic, and you lose a little bit of intensity. By having a custom profile, you're able to get all of that color back exactly the way you saw it. And I find it saves me so much color editing time to have a color profile. I probably picked the wrong one. I used a medium format back image. This is a 28 megapixel medium format back, so the file is absolutely huge. I should have picked a smaller camera to do this for you. Bear with me. Let me just check a couple questions. Okay, so there, it found the target. Remember, we were looking at this whole big image here. So it actually found the target with me holding it. Click Create Profile. Give it a name. This is a leaf back on my Mamiya DM28. And I would just click Save. I won't do that because I already have it saved. And then if I go to any image, let me open up, let me just hit Done here. Any image I shot with that camera at that scene. Let me pick up, let's see, what do I have here as far as medium format back? Here's one. This is a molten barn shot. Okay, let me just open this real quick. When I click on this RAW file, it will open in Adobe Camera Raw. Again, a lot of edits to do, but first thing I'll do is assign my camera profile. Here's the generic conversion. Here's the profile. Now it's subtle on landscape imagery for the most part because this sky was very subdued. But if you look closely, you can see there's a slight warming, a slight intensity, a slight color shift. But now I've got the colors exactly as they were created. And unfortunately, I can't show you the whole process, but I'm just going to show you a couple of files. By using the techniques that we've used right now to show you the before and after process, if you go through the process that I've shown you these steps to your images, you'll be amazed what happens to the image. Now, this is a panoramic that was stitched together. Now, you don't get out to the Grand Tetons that often when you live in New York. It was a trip that isn't going to be repeated a whole lot of times in your lifetime. But it was a hazy morning and there was a fire. You can see kind of the haze over here. So without going through the entire demonstration, but doing the same kind of tricks, doing the overlay, using Nik Visa to locally adjust brightness and color, and using Topaz Adjust Specify to add some definition to the image, we went from this to that. How's that for a dramatic change? So you can turn a basic, decent, good snapshot into an incredible photograph by doing this. And again, I guess I'll have to save this to part 2. Same thing, the Tetons. Adding some luminance. Here's Topaz Specify. Look what that did to bring out the detail in the trees. Burning down the sky and the mountains. Not burning them down, but adding that burn dodge layer. A little bit more intensity. Adjusting the color balance locally. Sharpening. And then I thought the image needed one more thing. I added some clouds, which again I'll have to save for a demonstration for another day. But you get to see here's what we ended up with. Again, you can take an image that is decent and turn it from kind of blah to amazing that quickly. So again, review what I've gone through. I will probably, what I'm seeing is I've probably really got another 2 hours worth. So what I'll do on my own is I will try to record myself a webinar in my own studio. And if you guys send me an email, I'll give you an email address. If you send me an email, I will let you know where you can get the recording. All right, so let's finish up. If you've got any questions about technique stuff, or you're looking forward to registering for some of the upcoming webinars, go on to xritephoto.com. Go into the Learning tab and you'll see a choice called Webinars. All of our upcoming webinars are listed there. So we're out of time. I'm sorry, I ran 10 minutes over, but thank you guys all for staying. It's great to have you all. Thanks for the questions. Great questions. And I hope to see you online again soon. So until then, everybody have a great rest of the day, great afternoon, great rest of the week, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.